A free speech crackdown on Britain's press is coming, if influential figures in the Labour Party are anything to go by. The Fabians Society, which counts half the cabinet as its members, including the Prime Minister, and boasts every Labour PM has also been a member, has published pressing issues, full of arguments for regulation of the press. Authors blast false accounts of grooming gangs, assert that the public were misled to vote for Brexit, and state the press are allowing debate on the reality of the climate crisis. So it must be reined in. Many ordinary Brits would likely thank the press for bringing to light the grooming gang scandal and for opening up debate on Brexit and net zero, but that doesn't seem to register here. After an international outcry, the government has capitulated on holding a full inquiry into the grooming gangs. But is commentary like this, dismissing them, a sign that the white working class victims are still not believed by the left? The Fabian Society promised to stand by its member Sir Keir Starmer when he moved into number 10. Starmer had been a member before becoming an MP and served on the executive committee. The Society previously bragged it's helped shape Labour's policy programme. Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, was chairman of the Cambridge Fabian Society. Some were angered when they discovered the judge who effectively ruled migrants could remain in the Bell Hotel in Epping was also a member, and for a year served as its chair. Now, the foreword to this paper was written by Tony Blair's former spokesman Alastair Campbell. He criticised the press over Brexit, saying they'd been banging the anti-European drum for decades, and they operated as cheerleaders for charlatans. But isn't a free press entitled to set out its view? Campbell complains of elite capture of the media, saying it puts progressive politics at a significant disadvantage, before arguing Labour has the power to effect fundamental change. Will this change mean putting the left at an advantage? The editor-in-chief of the Byline Times laments what she calls narratives of the press. These include opposition to benefits culture, that Brexit was the will of the people, that immigration is a key problem facing Britain, that the reality of the climate crisis is up for debate. Now, the fact that Brexit was the will of the people, expressed by the people in the largest vote in this country's history, and that immigration is consistently rated by Brits as one of their key areas of concern, don't seem to come into it. She praises the BBC's commitment to public service-driven editorial values, like impartiality, yet more than 60% of Brits don't trust the BBC to tell the truth. She points out the partisan press has no duty to be impartial before arguing politicians should be demanding much more of the media. The Online Safety Act should be expanded to cover newspapers, authors argue later on, with its requirement for platforms to delete legal but harmful content. Would that not deprive Brits of important information? Authors in the pamphlet want to beef up Ofcom or do away with it altogether and create a new, more aggressive one. They say the regulator is too timid and there must be reductions in harm. Who defines harm? Could harm end up being any of the left's dislikes, such as Brexit or secure borders? Distaste for our decision to restore our independence does run through this publication. So does dismissal of many of the things Brits care about. Net zero policies driving up the cost of energy, Britain's open borders, rising crime and attacks on our history. Do they just want to shut ordinary Brits down? With Alastair Campbell bemoaning the significant disadvantage the left faces with our free press, could new regulations be used to silence those who question the establishment? To force newspapers to parrot the government's line? The Fabian Society says the opinions expressed in the publication are those of its authors individually, and not of the society in general. But with its immense influence within Labour and over the Prime Minister, these arguments are likely to reflect the thinking of those around the cabinet table. Barrister Stephen Barrett has a bit more on the background of the Fabians and believes Britain's centrists do seek to stifle debate, but as Brits look for alternatives to answer our problems, their influence will wane. So what is the Fabian Society and why should we be paying attention to what they're talking about?
Well, the Fabian Society is a fascinating creature. It began in 1884, and it's widely believed that George Orwell wrote the novel 1984 as an example of what would happen after 100 years of the Fabians being in control and being active. So they've got a sort of sinister undercurrent. They come out of they have various splinter groups in the beginning. They have something called the Fellowship of the New Life, and that's very, I would say, puritanical. It's stoic. It believes in vegetarianism and pacifism, but that doesn't last very long. But they've got these sorts of deeply embedded ideas. There's an incredibly sinister video of George Bernard Shaw, who was a Fabian, calling for the killing of large numbers of people, and saying that he hoped in the future, every 5 years, every British citizen would have to go before a panel and justify why they should carry on living.
I object to all punishment whatsoever. I don't want to punish anybody. But there are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. Not in any unkind or personal spirit, but it must be evident to all of you, you must all know half a dozen people at least, who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. And I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board, just as he might come before the income tax commissioners, and say every 5 years or every 7 years, just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us and it can't be of very much use to you.
It's this desperate human need to control everything. The other key to note about them is that they are atheistic. So they would call themselves humanists. But I think we just call them atheists. And that's what then happens to the human mind when you get atheistic political movements, is that they largely become a religious replacement. So in many ways, I often will accuse the Fabian Society of being a cult. And they have they have lots of branches and lots of societies. They have, I think, 60 local branches. And I talked on them publicly. And then afterwards, I was approached by a young woman who said that she was still thought of herself as left-wing. And she had joined her local Fabians because she thought that they were like the intellectual branch of left-wing thinking. Now, I happen to know Claire Fox, and I'm also a great admirer of Lord Glassman, who both of whom are on the left, and both of whom are incredibly intellectual. And I don't believe either of them are Fabians. So I'm not entirely sure why she got the idea that the Fabians are the intellectual side of the left. I think that might be how they portray themselves. She explained that she left because they simply weren't intellectual. And I also like to think there's something deeply tragic about them. That it's currently chaired by Harriet Harman's son, and they operate in this way. I think every member of the government is a Fabian, and let's look at the outrageous successes of this current government. I mean, wow, they're doing brilliantly 14 months in, and everybody hates them. And society is largely collapsing, and I think everybody knows that we're heading towards an economic meltdown in November. So that's what I mean when I say that they have failure baked in, but they've very largely been able to take over most of the West with this thinking that really what they are is sort of centre lefties. They mean well. They are, not dangerous. They're not going to do anything that's too disruptive.
Well, I was just wondering, I mean, to be fair, you went into some of the things I was going to ask you, which is, is this a fringe group or are they influential? As you said, they have huge influence in the cabinet. So if they're starting to talk now about regulating the press, I mean, I read through the piece that they'd written, and a lot of it was anger about Brexit. It was talk about subsidies for the media. Why do you think that they're targeting the press?
So it's this sort of they were always in a doom loop. That's what I mean by baked in failure. Okay, they were always going to fail because they are recruiting people who are not capable